if you go back to 2020, there was a Russian-Turkish peace treaty or peace deal, ceasefire negotiated around Idlib. And that what that did was that froze the conflict. So you have this conflict which had been running for a long time. It basically froze. In the intervening period, the Syrian state has reinvented itself as a narco state. It's producing Captagon on a huge scale, which is flooding the markets. It's sort of synthetic amphetamine that's causing huge problems in the Middle East, Jordan particularly, and regional states. But you have to remember that Turkey and Russia were fighting each other in Syria, and that was the ceasefire in 2020 was negotiated to bring about an end to that.
Well, that was the midday update. Now let's talk about what is happening in Syria. Tens of thousands of people are fleeing the Syrian city of Homs as Islamist-led rebels continue to make advances. The group, which is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, seized the city of Hama yesterday in a further blow to President Bashar al-Assad, who lost control of Aleppo last week. I'm joined now by Charlie Gammell, who's a former British diplomat and an expert on the Middle East. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
Hi, Ed. How are you?
Very well. Tell us what is happening in Syria.
Well, I think as with everything in the Middle East, the local is regional and the regional is local. And what we're looking at here is, even though it's not a collapse of the Assad government, it's definitely an indication of how weak the Assad government is. And these rebels that are marching south, and they took obviously Aleppo recently, and then Hama, and now marching on Homs. They grew up out of the anti-Assad resistance, which started in 2011. Their makeup is Islamist, their makeup is jihadist, and within this coalition of groups, under which sits, or sort of under the HTS umbrella, there are different Turkish-backed Islamist groups that have been around basically since the start of the civil war in Syria. And I think the regional aspect here is that this is, I would see it as an unintended consequence of the weakening of Iran, the weakening of Hezbollah, and the weakening of, or I suppose the distraction of Russia, all on whom the Syrian regime depends for its domestic control and its domestic stability.
Yes, so that's exactly right, isn't it? I mean, Israel having attacked Hezbollah and also obviously taken on Iran, either directly or indirectly, weakens a huge amount of support for Assad's regime. What I don't understand is how much Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, how much influence Turkey has on them and what the significance is in terms of obviously Turkey's relationship with Syria. Turkey's relationship with Russia.
So I think the important thing here is that if you go back to 2020, there was a Russian-Turkish peace treaty or peace deal, ceasefire negotiated around Idlib. And that what that did was that froze the conflict. So you have this conflict which had been running for a long time. It basically froze. In the intervening period, the Syrian state has reinvented itself as a narco state. It's producing Captagon on a huge scale, which is flooding the markets. It's sort of synthetic amphetamine that's causing huge problems in the Middle East, Jordan particularly, and regional states. But you have to remember that Turkey and Russia were fighting each other in Syria, and that was the ceasefire in 2020 was negotiated to bring about an end to that. And this conflict has been frozen since then. And the interesting thing there, and I'll touch on Turkey-Russia, is that this is another indication that these conflicts in the region, they don't go away. We look at 2001 in Afghanistan when we thought the Taliban was defeated. It rose again. We look at 2003 in Iraq when we thought that the Ba'athist state had been defeated, but actually it just reinvented itself as IS to a degree. So these conflicts have a nasty habit of sparking back to life at very difficult times. Turkey-Russia relations are very complicated, and Syria is a sphere of influence. And I think we have to understand that when the world was concerned with ISIS, Russia and Iran were fighting against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, obviously. And when Donald Trump and when the West talk about having defeated ISIS, the Iranians would say, well, actually, no, you didn't defeat ISIS. We defeated ISIS. And a big complaint amongst the Iranians is always that the West's funding and arming of these anti-Assad groups from sort of 2013, 14 onwards was the sort of thing that the Iranians think ISIS grew out of. I mean, that's not quite true, but that's the accusation that Iran levels against the West, that instead of defeating ISIS, they actually helped create it. And Russia has a big interest in maintaining the port at Tartus, which is a strategic port for it into the Mediterranean, just as Iran has these strategic spheres of influence in Syria. And if you look at Homs and Hama, these are points through which Iranian arms shipments go to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is a really critical moment for Iran's support of Hezbollah. And even though people in Tel Aviv and Washington might rejoice at the defeat of Hezbollah or the weakening of Iran, we may very well soon have to contend with a massive problem, which is the creation of an Islamist state in Syria, or
Well, exactly. That's the point. That is the point, isn't it,
Russian.
Charlie? That is what is so interesting that is not coming out clearly enough. You've referred, I think, to ISIS 3.0. It is a profoundly kind of paradoxical point that in seeking to take down Assad and in theory backing, democracy in inverted commas, the right of the people against this dictator, you end up funding and arming, arguably as we did in the 1980s in Afghanistan, a force which is profoundly anti-Western and will increase massively the security risks in Western countries.
Yeah, and I think if we zoom out one step further, the challenge I think the particularly UK Foreign Office and policy has is that there is a failing of strategy there. And you use the example of 1980s in Afghanistan. Once that war was finished, we all thought, well, that war's finished. We can move on to bigger and badder problems. And I think we did the same thing after ISIS fell. We thought, well, actually, the problem of counterterrorism is no longer a thing. Our big problem is hostile state actors: Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, people who can pose a more strategic threat to us. But actually, what we fail to realize is that if we close one door, then we just leave one door open to someone else somewhere else. And I remember working as a diplomat in North Africa, and you'd have a lot of the North African government saying to me, Britain's taken its eye off counterterrorism, and actually that's just going to leave the door open to counterterrorism to start again. And you use the example of those camps in the north of Syria, which are run by Syrian democratic forces, the Kurdish militias, that are stocked to the brim with ISIS adherents and ISIS sort of zealots and their children. And the point at which those prisons get opened up, if that might happen, is kind of disaster zone for spread of Islamism across the region. So a really interesting lesson in unintended consequences, and a really interesting lesson that the world is global now. Geopolitics, you can't ignore one space and expect it to go away. These things will always have a habit of reappearing.
Charlie Gammell, former British diplomat, expert on the Middle East, thank you for coming on and discussing the situation as it is developing in Syria.